All right, we're going to start in about 1 minute. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started just to make sure Dr. Dodson has as much time as possible. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar series being offered by the Society of Counseling Psychology as a part of Dr. Mary O'Leary Wiley's presidential initiative focused on practice engagement. We are excited that hundreds of practitioners have joined us to learn more about redefining strength and healing, engaging Black men in therapy. I am Dr. Batsirai Bunzabaya. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm one of the tri-chairs of the Practice Engagement Presidential Initiative, along with Dr. Christopher Stoltz and Dr. Lisa Ferdinand. A special thank you to Dr. Esmita Pense, who is assisting us with the technology today. Please note that you must be present for the entire webinar to get CE credit. I will be sending more information via email about getting CE credit after the webinar. During today's webinar, you can ask questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. And for a period of the presentation, you can write some comments in the chat as well. And Dr. Dodson will let you know when you can engage in the chat. Following the webinar, I will be sending a PDF version of many of the PowerPoint slides presented today. Today's webinar is also being recorded and will be available in a few days on the Society of Counseling Psychology's YouTube channel. Now, I'd like to briefly introduce our presenters so that we can get started. Today, we have Dr. Milo Dodson, who is a licensed psychologist and serves as Senior Manager for Diversity and Inclusion and Community Outreach for Belkin International. His identity as a counseling psychologist informs his empowering approach for improving companies' diversity, equity, and inclusion commitments. Dr. Dodson co-hosts a podcast called Mental Health is Real, to discuss wellness, mental health, and social justice. Welcome, Dr. Dodson, and I'll turn it over to you.
All righty, peace and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when and where you are watching this live and or recorded. Again, my name is Dr. Milo Dodson, pronouns are him, he, and his. And I really just want to start off by expressing gratitude for you all joining us today. It seems like there's a lot of different cultural events and a lot of intersecting events going on right now. Obviously during Pride Month, for some of us, being able to celebrate Father's Day yesterday in various capacities, celebrating Juneteenth just a few days ago. And so I find myself again, just feeling really thankful for being in community today. Truth be told, I definitely had to push back my jury duty summons because that just happened to randomly pop up over the last couple of weeks, and that's always fun, right? So all that being said, there's a lot to be able to talk about today, and I really want to just, again, start off from a place of gratitude. So to get us started, when I was preparing today, and this is, relevant for what we're talking about, when I was preparing today, I found myself grappling a little bit more with my ongoing imposter syndrome, not because I haven't talked about this topic before, not because I haven't familiarized myself with the research, but now moving from a clinical setting where I was at for 8 years at the UC Irvine Counseling Center to now being in more of a corporate space working at Belkin. Again, I found myself feeling almost, like I said, grappling with imposter syndrome or feeling a little bit nervous and insecure about today. So I wanted to be able to name that as it's relevant to what we're talking about. And myself as a Black man who has been in therapy, wanting to offer that appropriate level of disclosure. And again, sharing that gratitude for everyone being able to join in today. So to move forward, My hope is to address and to discuss these three various learning objectives. In terms of CEs, in terms of content and such, we will be exploring this at a more introductory level. One, or primarily because of our time being so short. And I really want to leave some time for the end for discussion, for conversation, and Q&A. So the first is really just being able to identify key considerations for providing individual therapy to Black men. Lots of different ways to approach that, whether we're at the collegiate level, whether we're working with minors, and maybe combination thereof working with adults outside of the collegiate level. So we'll discuss all of that together. The second is to be able to describe opportunities for addressing the intersectionality with Black men. So even with that statement alone, we're talking about a racial identity and we're talking about gender identity. And I remember even throughout my own training, being asked in a certain way to focus only on one identity. And that particular exercise was around gender identity, kind of a seminar focus. But I really think that there's much lost when particularly we're talking about Black men and we're only focused on one. So we'll talk about some of the themes and the different levels of socialization that goes specifically into providing support and providing therapy for Black men in a way that we're going to be talking about both or all intersections. But again, just for this brief example, around race and gender. And then finally, not going to get too heavy in terms of diagnostic information, but more so providing some statements that I've heard throughout all of the clinical work that I've done with Black men. And again, primarily explaining the multicultural nuance for not just the diagnoses, but also the symptom review. Being able to understand that you're not just maybe going to hear the textbook definition of loss of interest in activities, previously enjoyed, prolonged sadness, depressed mood, etc., but really making sure that we're listening with empathy and we're listening with multiculturally informed lenses to understand how we can provide support for folks. So before I do anything, whether it's talking about a clinical conceptualization, whether it's in my new gig, talking about different D&I work or giving different keynote addresses, it's always important for me to ground myself in my own multicultural background because this informs my worldview and it informs my clinical approach. So I provide these here, not just in terms of creating a list of check marks here and there, but as we're thinking about our own cultural lenses as therapists, as psychologists, social workers, wherever we are today, making sure that we are accounting for not just our marginalized identities, not just our oppressed identities, but also how we hold privilege in some contexts. Making sure that I, as a man, am owning, as a cisgender heterosexual male, I'm owning my privilege in that way. Because I know that in the past, whether I've, inadvertently or mistakenly perpetuated sexism, perpetuated misogyny, or maybe just didn't speak up loudly enough against that from what I've heard and observed, it's necessary for me to make sure I'm owning all of my lenses here today. And as we think about providing therapy for folks, making sure that we're understanding all of that complexity, that beautiful tapestry of marginalized and privileged identities. So even when we get into a little bit more of the specifics, and I won't have time to go into depth with this today, how when I disclose and name my biracial identity, the conversations that a lot of Black men have with me about that or questions that they may have. Like, well, you were raised primarily or only by your Italian side, Dr. Milo, so you really get what it means to be Black in America. And I'm open to, again, not just disclosing that, but making sure I'm open to having those conversations after I disclose, because that's part of the experience in therapy, in that therapeutic dyad, to make sure that clients know that they are being seen and properly understood, and not just coming at this from a very Eurocentric blank slate, or a Eurocentric you're you and I'm me, and we're never really going to have that exploration. So again, I list all of these for that purpose, as well as it informs clinical practice, as well as just for all of you watching today to be able to get to understand the lens that I created this presentation. So I offer this next portion here as it relates to various themes of masculinity and how that's viewed in African American men. Now, as a disclaimer, there's lots and lots of models, there's theories, there's combinations thereof, even how we're maybe operationalizing masculinity, and then not just for Black men, but African American men in particular. So some of that national identity, that racial and ethnic identity combination thereof. Just as a disclaimer, this particular model from Mincy et al. So I want to bring our attention, for starters, just to the three different categories for the beginning here. I know there's a lot of text on the screen, so let's just start there. So the first category in terms of themes of how masculinity is viewed in African American men, as that's informing our conversation today about redefining strength and healing. So what it means to be a man. Sometimes there's a theme of this gradual process, or this kind of, some of us may say, a developmental approach. There's this responsibility where we got to take care of business as a provider and or as a mentor. There's this theme of standing alone. So a man stands on his own and supports himself without help from others. So thinking about that, let's drill down a little bit. If a man and a Black man were to say, hey, I have to be able to stand on my own to be a man, to have a sense of my gender identity, I have to isolate myself. I have to stand in isolation for me to be able to fulfill the very definition of what I've understood to be a man. So even right off the bat, we're seeing that there's this isolation that may sometimes also connect to loneliness, sadness, depression, etc. So when we're, again, moving into this next theme of sacrifice, we're isolating ourselves at times to maybe do what's needed to get the job done. And whether or not we have that family orientation, whether we may or not have characteristics of our father or one of our parents and guardians, we've automatically and right off the bat somehow assumed these to be the definitions or the only ways to be a man. And again, we haven't nuanced it yet to be a Black man, but just the very definition of masculinity to get us started here. So being able to listen for commentary from clients that may or may not match some of these themes, that may or may not match some of these definitions. So if we then move into the second category of what it means to be a Black man, that again, that beautiful tapestry, that complex identity there, that intersection, that we now, in addition to all of these other pieces of just a gender identity, that now we have something to prove. Now these themes have taken on different levels of affect. We have the different connection to some of these themes, and there's more emotion involved because of that intersection. So as a Black man, you have something to prove to yourself, to society, to your family, and others, that you aren't just a statistic, and you can achieve, that you have that value, and that you have that worthiness or that deservingness. So again, even what I had disclosed to you all when we were getting started, there's that feeling that I've had almost since I was socialized as a young Black boy in America, that I still have something to prove, that I still have something that I've achieved, that I am worthy enough to be here before all almost 400 of folks attending, to making sure that you know that, hey, I know what I'm talking about here. So again, combined with that something to prove, that responsibility of having a lot to live up to, that we have more than just the stereotypes to push back against, that we are more than just what society may say that we are at times, that I am at times. And so when, again, we're talking about this theme here about strong and strength, which is why we're going to talk about that shortly in the next slide. Black men are the strongest of all men because we're pushing back and we have a lot to go through. So we have to be strong enough to overcome that, all with a different attitude, overcoming stereotypes that people have against me, against us. So when we're now looking at, again, not just what it means to be a man, but also what it means to be a Black man, now we ask ourselves, okay, well, who or what has influenced some of our various ideas, or the way that we've conceptualized masculinity? And again, as a disclaimer, I want to own that this is somewhat biased or somewhat limited in the understanding of the theme with a mother and father, but wanting to focus even more so, not just on a sexist or heterosexist point of view here, but focusing on parents, that both parents have played an equal role in helping us develop the characteristics of being a man, moving away from the you know assumption of gender being a binary, but and understanding that a mother and a father, or two parents for that matter, has influenced that identity to some regard. And then, so we have the parental sphere of influence, we have the self understanding of that influence, as well as friends, social circles, maybe even understanding manhood, or and personhood there as a point in my life based off of a specific situation. So, based off of how I handle a situation, that actually will give a theme of how I'm understanding manhood, of how I'm understanding my identity as a Black man. So, as we're thinking about what a lot of the times may come up in therapy, as we're providing therapy, we're providing care for Black men in therapy, how we maybe even from the beginning engage in the first place, what's necessary for us to do is to take a step back, to reflect on how we as clinicians define strength. So in the chat, this would be the opportunity, and I hope it's open now. I think it should be. Um, in the chat, I'm just curious for, again, if we were in person, I'd be asking folks to raise their hand, to kind of shout out how we define strength. So in the chat, if you would be so kind as to be able to, maybe in a word or two, maybe in a brief sentence, being able to share what we think the definition of strength is. So we see a combination, and I love this, a combination of what we've even seen somewhat in the themes, right? So hard work, being vulnerable, owning one's weakness or challenge. We'll definitely be talking about that in a second. Resiliency, access to a range of emotions. Wow, there are a lot of responses here to move through. Okay, so vulnerability, the ability of willingness to be vulnerable, facing fear, resiliency, asking for help. Thank you for that, Ashley. That's brilliant. Wow, it is. I haven't given a presentation in a while to other mental health professionals. Again, primarily in the corporate context these days, and this is a lot of responses, more so than what I usually get. Okay, empathy, accountability. I'm gonna keep going through these. Perseverance. Yes, yes, yes. Openness challenge and change and self-reflection. Awesome. We can keep going on as we as mental health professionals reflect here, and as we maybe take a couple minutes to review some of these responses. A lot of what I've experienced prior to my own journey in therapy, prior to my own educational trajectory and training, a lot of what ends up happening is that right off the bat, vulnerability has become or is viewed as being a liability for a lot of Black men. And I'll talk about that more in a second. But you see how so many of us, myself included, are answering this question in terms of what strength is, answering that from a place of vulnerability, right? We're saying basically to be strong is to be vulnerable. Now, if some of us may have previously worked with Black men, some of us may in this space identify as Black men, we're hopefully moving past that that strength is something that we just have to be stoic, right? It's not about rugged individualism. It's not about, as a theme pointed out, standing alone, standing in isolation. That even so many of us here, dozens of us, have quite literally defined strength as vulnerability. But for a lot of folks, that may not be the case. Because if I'm already coming at this from a place, maybe my racial identity is more salient, if I'm going to express myself, that means that I have a liability where people can either physically and or emotionally attack me. And so why would I want to be vulnerable? So a lot of the work in a clinical context can change from vulnerability and strength, moving from a liability to a strength, right? And so if we think about what healing looks like, if we think about how we understand, and again, in the chat here, feel free to jump in for this portion as well. In the chat here, if we can understand or to state what does healing look like to you, this informs our clinical practice, just like we're understanding what strength means. So when we're understanding, so far in the chat, I'm seeing peace, being able to bring peace and emotional release, right? To release is to experience relief. Some of us are saying that there's an increased flexibility, an awareness and acceptance to our external circumstances as well as some of our internal circumstances. If we're now wanting to think about healing, there's a willingness to engage differently with ourselves and our external environment, right? So a lot of self-compassion, a lot of belief in ourselves, a lot of growth is what I'm seeing. I love that as well. That's almost verbatim for what I have in a couple slides here. Genuineness and more genuineness instead of relying on defense mechanisms. Absolutely, that authenticity, that genuine nature, accepting that we can't change or remain motivated to what we can change, right? Relief from stickiness towards movement. Absolutely. So this rebuilding of self-introspection. And what all of us have named here is that it's more of, in some form or fashion, if I'm doing a millisecond long thematic analysis, what we're really naming here is that there's a process of healing. We all know as clinicians that this isn't about a destination. We all know as clinicians that healing or being healed, quote unquote, isn't something that we just get to, wipe our hands, we're good for the rest of our lives. We as clinicians know that this is an ongoing process. And so in some of the research that I've looked at, in some of the clinical experiences that I've had, both as a clinician and as a client, we know that this is an ongoing process and a journey. And so visually for folks, I'm wanting to really name here that as we're working with Black men, it's not just understanding this from a place of first being hurt and then moving to healed. our interventions, our theoretical orientation, our conceptualization, and we'll get to in the next couple slides here an approach for how that has looked like for me. This isn't just about saying I've been hurt and I want to get to a place of being healed. What this is actually about is saying that we are healing and growing. So if we're going back in a couple slides here, when we're asking ourselves and asking our clients what strength is about doing something that's difficult, right? So strength is about being vulnerable enough to engage in healing. Just like sometimes we may want to exercise, sometimes we may want to be in the gym, sometimes we may want to move our body and still our minds. This is about healing and growing in an ongoing journey and in an ongoing process. Because we can't just continue to think about this from a Eurocentric point of view, where you're going from point A to point B, whether that's based off of our theoretical orientation and or a diagnostic information. This is about explaining and showcasing to our clients who are Black men that healing is an ongoing journey and that they're going to be supported and not judged at every step from beginning to termination. And even though the sessions may have maxed out, even though we may have terminated in a particular way, this is about encouraging the ongoing healing and growth throughout life. Because again, vulnerability is how we're now wanting to redefine strength. And vulnerability allows us to max out, or to, I should say, increase our healing, to create more of that max potential for healing. Thinking about, again, that this is more of a process and a journey than a final or end destination. So what has this looked like in my own practice? Definitely starting from a place of Rogerian and person-centered, being able to keep that unconditional positive regard, empathy, and congruency. Congruency in a cultural way of saying it, being able to keep it real, being able to name any sort of countertransference, being able to name what's coming up in the room, and first and foremost, providing a safe environment for clients to explore the interpersonal dynamics. Whether we or not may identify as a Black man, whether we share one or two of those multicultural identities, making sure that, again, I've grounded my work in that Rogerian approach. Now, sometimes, depending on the nature of the work, depending on the setting, being able to also add CBT interventions. I've intentionally here crossed out maladaptive just based off of some of the way we previously or other times talk about CBT. Crossing out maladaptive, and in that moment with a client, being able to really observe or show them that I'm paying attention to what is a unhelpful thought instead. Being able to actually name, hey, while this is true, while this actually exists in the environment, while racism is very real, how do we want to then maybe reshape or re-understand those thoughts? And even those thoughts that may be true, are they helpful? And that has been a really, really big pivot point for me to at first validate that pain that a lot of Black men experience, to then be able to pivot to really peeling back some of those feelings, and ultimately how those thoughts and feelings impact and influence behaviors. So finally, again, moving through these challenging assumptions by looking for proof. Some of us may think about that from our social anxiety work, with looking at rational responses, challenging some of those negative automatic thoughts, working through mindfulness relaxation with folks, and then finally looking at time management to increase some of that balance, some of that harmony, whether that's been for academic student clients that I've had, student athlete clients, other clients outside the collegiate context. So continuing just with an overview, by no means is this a review of Rogerian work today, but just kind of giving some framework for understanding how I've navigated the space. Um, and then also providing a little bit of definition of maladjustment. So when the clients that I've had who identify as Black men, that perception of who they are doesn't align with who or how they view others or the outside world, the environments that they're in. Looking at that misalignment or that maladjustment is really, really key. And again, first providing that level of validation and empathy. So moving forward, finally, what I found to be helpful is my work is aimed at aligning or matching more of that congruency for helping folks develop their own experience and their own self-concept. Thinking about those themes that we reviewed from the beginning, working through not just what we understand a man to be, not just what we understand a Black man to be, and those different spheres or levels of influence, but really working towards that self-actualization, to have that self-agency, to build those tools for change. So these next couple of slides are examples of what I've used in terms of a course of treatment. So obviously, first and foremost, we're wanting to build rapport. I can't stress enough the importance of this, regardless of our theoretical orientation, making sure that even if we don't follow or want to incorporate Rogerian practices or a theoretical orientation into our clinical work, how do you then build rapport with Black men, especially if you do or don't share those identities? Being able to provide an empathetic environment to allow, as some of us have mentioned in the chat, to allow a full range of emotion. It's not just about telling Black men that we can't be angry. It's also about exploring that in more depth. What's behind that anger? What's informing that anger? And also knowing that anger is a valid emotion to have. We don't have to, at times, go beyond that. Anger is a valid emotion, period, hard stop, that's it. So as we're thinking about expanding our social support system, how do we then know about what sources or what levels of support our clients have, whether that's on a college campus, whether that's in the community, making sure that we're thinking about the individual in the greater context of not just, again, isolation, because that would almost perpetuate some of those themes that we've seen early on. The other piece here, and as you see on the last bullet point, is to be able to show a commitment to self-education. Being able to make statements to our clients, being able to say, hey, I'm educating myself on X, Y, and Z, because I don't expect you to educate me about the experiences in your background. I want to be committed to this relationship. And so I'm showing you that I'm empathizing, I'm building rapport by also highlighting the fact that I'm going to be educating myself. So as we think about where we go after we're building rapport, providing some empathetic support, that middle phase of treatment, being able to focus on the here and the now with some mindfulness exercises. I myself find that to be so critical, because not only are you creating that metacognition, but you're also allowing folks to name all of the range of emotions without judgment. Again, as we think about all the different definitions of mindfulness, about we can kind of just summarize here by saying it's about paying attention on purpose in any particular moment. The key to all this is with a non-judgmental attitude. So after we build that rapport, being able to name that full range of emotion as we're engaging in mindfulness exercises is really, really critical because that allows folks to then take that and practice on their own, or to be that much more aware in all of their other interpersonal interactions. So after some of that, what I've done in the past is being able to provide a handout for understanding different communication styles. I'm sure there's dozens of those that we have access to, all very good. But the key, as we're talking about here, is really, really focusing on vulnerability as a strength, being able to understand that strength-based intervention, and as a counseling psychologist, taking a strengths-based approach to identifying and challenging some of those unhelpful thoughts. So if you're saying that you need to just do this on your own, if you're saying that you need to practice and to uphold certain beliefs, do those, even those beliefs may be true, are those helpful? Are those going to align with what goals you name that you ultimately have? Now, as I mentioned earlier, anger in itself is a valid emotion. And I'm not going to, at times, need to deconstruct that with folks. But the pivot point in what I've used as a clinical intervention is being able to say that anger is a bodyguard to sadness. So when we're listening for certain statements to come up saying like, well, I just need to be angry right now because this is such a messed up situation, or I'm angry because I lost a loved one, being able to really hear that, to sit with that for a second and allow Black men to understand, hey, I'm wondering if there's a level here that if you were sad, what might that look like? And a lot of times, again, as clinicians, we know there's going to be some overlap there. So when we can position anger as kind of this first phase, that then we can validate what's behind that anger, is going to allow for more of that vulnerability and ultimately allow for more of the healing to take place. And again, we're also showing a commitment to self-education. So finally here, when we think about the end, and I should also mention that disclaimer, I'm approaching this in a short-term model for treatment, just having all of my clinical experiences being at various counseling centers, collegiate settings, some of us in private practice, and or some of us in collegiate settings where we can practice more long-term, adjusting accordingly. So if you don't take away the 1 to 3, in the middle phase and this termination phase, just being able to break this up into thirds essentially. So being able to understand that Black men have a path and a journey of healing to then be more self-confident and more self-reliant, while not necessarily doing everything in isolation, but more so being able to have an increase and expanded understanding of self. Then after we've heard what goals are, after we've heard what values are, what's important for them, to be able to understand that there's a congruence in between self and the ideal self. That non-judgmental piece for mindfulness allows us to have a little bit more wiggle room, a little bit more flexibility in what is the current self and then what we're working towards. Being able to say that perfection doesn't exist, being able to say that perfection is a lie, essentially, and it's something that we have our eye on, but not something that we feel like we need to get to still have healing take place. When we've then learned that we have that clients can have more inner confidence and feel more comfortable with relationships, to expand more emotional expression, to be able to expand more emotional vulnerability, sometimes for some of my clients that has looked like taking a more proactive and confident approach to initiating conversations. Again, this isn't an end all be all. This isn't an exhaustive list of what some treatment outcomes can look like. It's really just based off of the themes that we saw in the previous research, as well as some of my own clinical experiences. And I really want to name that because I know there's lots of different nuances, there's lots of different complexities, whether that's based off of the range or the length of treatment, the different types of settings that we can engage clients in. But there's lots and lots to look through for that. So as we round out in these next couple of slides, again, as we're talking about the outcomes of treatment, I want to share a little bit more about how we understand some of the diagnostic work and a symptom review. So a lot of times we, I would say, never should we assume that clients are just going to tell us, I'm anxious because X, Y, and Z, or I'm having depressive symptoms because X, Y, and Z. And for clients who may identify as Black men, these have been some of the more common statements that I've heard. And even, again, full transparency, some of the thoughts and experiences that I've had are on the screen here. So again, from the song, my mind is playing tricks on me. It's not me, they're just racist. I'm not crazy, I'm just stressed. Or even I'm not anxious, I'm just stressed. So in that last piece, what we're listening to is minimizing some of the experiences to feel more comfortable with what's normalized as stress and not anxiety. Because sometimes to feel is to fail. If I'm really engaging in sharing some of my anxious symptoms, some of my anxious thoughts, then somehow I failed. Again, going back to the research that we started with, I failed to not just be a man, I failed to be a Black man. So there's this level of achievement that we talked about that goes into not being crazy or not being anxious. Finally, settling into a little bit more of an understanding around depressive symptoms. So I'm just really tired, that's all. Like, it's no big deal. I'm not sad, I'm not depressed, Dr. Milo. I'm just really tired. And then you ask, well, how often are you tired? How often are you feeling that fatigue? Well, pretty much every day, even if I get good sleep. So then being able to hear that with our multiculturally informed clinical lens, to then pivot around to say, well, I wonder what sadness may look like for somebody who's sad or who's tired or fatigued. And I'm just not really me anymore. Like, I just don't feel, and again, looking at some of that anhedonia, I'm just not interested in my hobbies, or I don't have time for my hobbies. But if you take that a step further, it may be the case that there is time, they just don't have a level of interest. So finally, you wouldn't be able to understand, so why bother talking about it? Whether that's around shared multicultural identities with Black men in therapy, whether that's different, you just want to understand, so why bother talking about it? What they're really talking about here is a sense of helplessness and or hopelessness. So to conclude this slide, as we're thinking about not just a symptom review, as we're thinking about not just creating various diagnoses, I want to leave you with a quote from one of my mentors, Dr. Bill Parham, who has shared with me in various capacities. When you listen to clients long enough, they will be able to tell you what they need. And if you listen just a little bit longer, they'll be able to tell you how you can help them. So if we're thinking about just some of these statements on the screen, that's what we're talking about here. That's kind of like that top level. They're telling you what they need. And then it's up to us to really sit with that, with this multiculturally informed approach, knowing some of these themes, knowing some of these categories, to be able to take that a step further in a very nuanced way. So in summary, as we round out here, five major areas that we talked about as it fulfilled the learning objectives: being able to have an increased awareness of our own identities, being able to have an expanded definition of strength and healing, not just from how we personally think about it, but knowing some of the different cultural nuances out there that we've explored. The nuanced intersection of ethnicity and gender, again, as that relates to African American men. We've looked at and examined a symptom review for diagnostic purposes, whether that's going to ultimately be within an anxiety disorder cluster of diagnoses, a depressive disorder, or may not be the case. It may just be something more specific to a code for discrimination that folks have experienced in the workplace or a school setting. And then finally, the importance here, which I didn't want to get to because I recognize that not everyone here is going to be in a collegiate setting, but the opportunity for those who are to create or to continue to be connected to different groups on campus for Black men. At UC Irvine, I was able to create for as part of my intern work a group called Wabruda, which is Swahili for brotherhood, to have Black men come together on campus in a non-clinical setting to just be able to express and to be able to release. And that informed, again, going over all the ethical considerations there, but that informed and allowed for folks to be able to say, hey, I know that this is supportive, and now that I've had some practice expressing myself, now I can think about therapy as just a continuation of expressing myself. Being able to really destigmatize mental health, to destigmatize therapy, what that means and what it doesn't mean is really, really helpful. So just a couple, again, top level, high level points as summaries. And that is all for today. Thank you all for being here. And I would love to have a conversation, answer questions, and continue from there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dodson. I feel like there's so much that you said that resonated with me. But I think when you said to feel is to fail, I feel like that just spoke to so many of the clients that I've had. So thank you so much for your whole presentation. So to everybody, please feel free to use the question and answer to ask some questions. I will go ahead and read the first question, which is, how do you toe the line with avoiding being invalidating about experiences with marginalization when you try and discuss the unhelpfulness of a certain thought with a person of color? For example, you were describing somebody reacting to a situation as overtly racist.
So great question. And that line isn't as static and definitely not as finite as it would seem. And if I present it as such, I apologize, but that's really fluid and dynamic. Ultimately, what I think this is about is listening twice and speaking once to understand what clients' values are and what their goals are. So if I'm being able to express, hey, while this is valid, is this going to help you? Is this something that you want to continue? Because you're validating that external piece so that clients don't internalize all of the negativity and the harmful mental health impacts of racism, the health impacts of racism, et cetera. So in that line that we're creating almost from an operationalized approach here, we're being able to say like, this is valid. And is this something that you want to internalize? And the answer is going to be no. Is this external piece something that you want within you? And the answer being no. So that, again, that validation, that affirmation allows that distancing, so then they can then decide like what's going to be helpful for folks. So
thank you so much. The next question is, thank you so much. This was super helpful. I would be interested in how you would apply this in working with OCD.
And applying with OCD, sure. I think in full transparency, just off the bat, I haven't had as much experience with clients who have presented with OCD symptoms. So my first step would be to definitely consult around that. The second piece I would say from the limited experience that I have had is the consistency being key. And also, as some of us have defined here in the chat, the approach with self-compassion being key, and that non-judgmental piece when we're finding ourselves having obsessive thinking and or compulsive behavior, being able to really name that out loud, to be able to really name, I'm distracted, distracting thought, anxious, depressed, etc. um, I think that allows for more flexibility in the approach. But again, just wanting to be fully transparent and authentic myself, that would be something that I would want to consult and spend some time doing a little bit more research, and talking with colleagues about for sure.
The next question is, do you have any thoughts about how African Americans and Africans share these healing spaces, or what concerns arise in those spaces? Or have African individuals ever taken concern with the use of African language for the groups?
African sure, sure. So if I'm understanding that correctly, I think, and part of what I wanted to capture today is the difference and the multiple identities that go into saying that I identify as African American, or any person identifying as African American, that racial identity, that ethnic identity, um, the national identity, etc. And as that then relates to some of these conversations, these concepts, as I mentioned, naming the group that I created with Labruda, I think it's about being able to honor and understand the lineage, and being able to understand the heritage and the history that goes into creating that. So as to not maybe inadvertently appropriate something from a language that I don't fully speak, to be able to say like, hey, this is the connection, these are the roots, to be able to name that, again, to be authentic about it. So then that way it doesn't come off as being incongruent, or it doesn't come off as being offensive to some folks. But again, that has come up a lot actually as I think about working on a college campus, folks who are African American, as well as students who were born and spent most of their lives, whether it's in Kenya, Nigeria, a lot of clients at Irvine that way. So yeah, great question.
So the next question is, any specific responses to men who are still investing in toxic masculinity belief systems?
Yeah, and what was the first part before any thoughts you said?
Yeah, any specific responses to men who are still?
Sure. Um, well, I think knowing who I am in the room with clients, whether that's in an individual setting and or in the group setting, uh, a lot of my work personally has been to empathetically challenge some of that toxicity, to be able to come at it from a place of knowing what their values are, knowing what's important for them, to challenge, like saying, hey, that doesn't really align. It doesn't seem like that aligns with what we previously talked about. Let's talk more about that. Or if people are really committed to more of that toxic masculinity, being able to say and kind of call it out, like if we were to hear microaggression or an insensitive comment another way, being able to really make, as Dr. Sue says, being able to make the invisible visible, being able to say, hey, that doesn't seem like something very kind to say, and then kind of just leaving it there and allowing that space, um, to really value some of that silence, to value that interpersonal exchange, because I know that um, sexism isn't women's issue to solve, it's men's. And I think if I can approach that on a one-to-one basis in that setting, that's the opportunity to do that. And then to not just address it, but then to have a follow-up with men who are still upholding some of those thoughts or some of those practices and beliefs, to have a follow-up saying like, hey, what was that like for you right there? Right? Like, what was that like for me to challenge you and to say like, that was a pretty unkind statement? And then it just leading to more growth, more healing, and conversation. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Another question is, have you had any experience with well-educated African American men for example, PhDs, MDs, JDs, and so on? If so, are there any additional insights you have about working with African American men whose professional identity makes it difficult for them to be vulnerable in therapy?
Sure, sure. So to answer the first part of the question, yes, I have had experience. The second part, my approach would be to really, I can kind of summarize it to this: your worth is not your work. So I'm not as interested in the degrees, the letters. I'm more interested in exploring who they are as a person in that setting with respect and acknowledging that that's very important to them. That's a part of their identity, and also being able to make statements like you can get tenure, you can get promotion, all these other things. That's not going to increase your value as a Black man or as an African American man. Similarly, you can fail out of medical school, you can get fired, and that's not going to decrease your value as an African American or a Black man. So being able to show in that moment, that's a beautiful example of unconditional positive regard, to be able to say, I see you. Sometimes in that moment, I may be able to say, I see you, brother. And I'm not interested in you continuing to be professionally successful if that's at the cost of your physical and your mental health. So if you're interested, and again, they're coming to therapy, so you have the assumption that they're wanting to explore, right? Um, I think sometimes it's also about meeting people where they are and kind of taking that slowly, to not oversaturate or over inundate them right off the bat. But again, it comes down to, for me, that simple statement. It's actually rather profound, that your worth is not your work.
I feel like that's such a great reminder, and I think it's easy for all of us to kind of get lost in that. One last question, because I'm mindful of the time.
Absolutely.
How do you navigate getting the client to process through the feelings of anger when their ability to suppress that anger is a sense of survival in society? So the additional question to that is, am I weakening their way of moving through this world and retaining their resilience?
Yeah, I would ask, maybe not as the initial question, but as somewhat of a follow-up. I think this makes sense, saying like, hey, I'm wanting to validate this anger, and I know that it has been useful for you in XYZ, given whatever the situation is. Is that something that you want to continue to use as a coping mechanism? Or maybe can I offer you something else to add to your toolkit? Is this the only way that we want to move forward? Is this the only tool that we want to have in our arsenal? Or can I maybe offer you something else, invite you to consider adding something else? And then being able to say, I've heard you mention so many different times that anger has been a survival mechanism. I'm wondering what thriving may look like for you, not just surviving. I'm wondering if we can maybe expand what meaning and what purpose we have in life here, to be able to take that a step further, not just survive, but do more than survive. And so as I'm creating that space and as I'm validating that anger, encouraging expansion as a way of expanding strength, that usually frees up a little bit more wiggle room. And then from there, you just take it developmentally.
All right, thank you so much. We are right at time. And I know that the chat is not open, but I have received some thank yous in the question and answer. So a lot of people really appreciating your comments. And it has been so helpful just to think about how to work with Black men more effectively. So thank you again, Dr. Dodson, for presenting for us today. And again, for everybody, you will receive an email with some of the information from today, as well as CE information. So thank you again, Dr. Dodson.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Here.
Bye.